Jazakallah khairan for joining us today for our talk titled Palestine and Palestine, a history of struggle and resilience, brought to us by a very special speaker. Inshallah, before I introduce him, just a little background information about him. So Brother Osama Abdl-Haleem is a PhD candidate in the political geography of the Middle East at the University of Kentucky. He completed his master's on the political geography of Palestine. He has done several series of lectures in the past, including a year-long history of the Ummah for the Muslim students at UW-Madison, which can be found on YouTube. He also did a lecture series on the modern origins of Palestine for the Lombard Muslim community. And without further ado, Brother Osama, to the stage.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair, Brother Yunus and Muhammad for helping set this all up, and to my sister Aisha for making this happen, inshallah. Quick correction, not that it's important, but my PhD is actually in religious geography, I do political geography as well, and those, they kind of overlap, but I specifically study religious geography, masajid, Muslim communities. So, going forward, I thought I'd start out by just lightly making fun of UIC's MSA, just a little bit. As Brother Muhammad was very kind of that to help out with setting all of this up, and at some point, and I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but I think it's an important part of why we're talking about all of this, and it actually plays into the main message that we have here today, inshallah. That at some point you guys sent me your kind of outline of what a talk on Palestinian history would look like from your perspective. And I think you started with talking about the meaning of Masjid Aqsa and Assam, and then the history of Quds, the history of Jerusalem in the early era of Islamic history, and then the Crusades, and then the kind of British colonization, and then the modern state of Palestine, and all of that in essentially an hour-long talk. And we're not going into all that because that would be impossible to do in this amount of time. And I just bring that up because I think it's really wonderful that you have students here who are studying all sorts of other topics, but who, in their hearts, especially seeing what's going on in the world, really want to know what's our history, what's the history of Palestine. If we're going to be talking about this and seeing it in the media and dealing with it in so many other aspects of our lives, we want to understand what's that history. We really want to dive in to know how do we deal with ourselves in the present, given the path that we've already come down, and we want to know what's our Islamic history and what's our place in this world, and those are excellent desires that we have. But we also have to remember that this is not something that we can just do in a single lecture. We're not just going to get on YouTube and watch a few videos and feel that we've now come to a point where we understand our history or the history of any topic that is really worth delving into. This is something that, even if it's not your major, even if it's not what you're dedicating your career to, this is something that has to be a lifelong pursuit. And it really has to be, because it's the thing that we're missing most now in our education of the Muslim Ummah. We need to know our history. We need it desperately. We need it on topics as specific as the modern history of Palestine, and we need it to understand the full history of the Ummah, and we really need it to understand the world that we live in. So this has to be a prolonged engagement that we have, inshallah, and this is just one part of this. So I bring this up not to put anyone down or raise myself up, just to bring in what's supposed to be the main message of this kind of pursuit, the emphasis that this has to be something that we're going to be engaging with, inshallah, as often and as much as we can. So, diving into the history of Palestine itself, the era that I'm focusing on is the creation of the modern situation of Palestine. So we're going to be looking at mostly the kind of British colonial era here. We'll end at 1948 instead of starting there, because I want to emphasize a particular aspect of this history that we've tended to kind of shy away from here. So that is the basics of our talk. We'll look into the history of the origins of modern Palestine, Palestine as we engage it today. And then these will kind of bleed together. I'll kind of leave the common myths on Palestine up for our discussion here, and we can dive into some of those issues and talk about how we address them today. So, Palestine, to understand this modern stage of Palestinian history, we really need to understand the era of World War I, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and the beginning of the modern world. So there's a particular period here that's really going to establish not only the issues of Palestine, but actually when you look at this history, it's a turning point for the entire world. It's the birth of a whole new global political order. And most of the issues that we face today on a political and social level can be traced back to this moment. And if I had to pick one other moment, I would say 1492, the discovery of America, is the next most significant moment before this one. But there's a particular moment, we'll be talking about the years World War I officially is 1914 to 1919. Really the later part of those years is where things are going to get really significant for us. So this is the Ottoman Empire right at the beginning of World War I. The orange area here specifically. At its greatest extent, it extended to the rest of the map that we see here. By 1914, by the beginning of World War I, it had declined down to essentially that orange-yellow area there. Obviously, Palestine being squarely in the middle of that territory. And it's really important for us to understand what Palestine is. Palestine is a place that has been called Palestine for a very long time, but didn't look like what we consider Palestine today. It didn't have exactly the same way of expressing itself in the world as we see today with those particular borders and the idea of it being its own kind of independent state. Palestine, throughout its very long history, the name Palestine itself is about 3,000 years old, just the word. It's changed over time, but some form of the word Palestine is about 3,000 years old, referring to that specific area. There are other names for that area as well, but that was one of them. And during that time, Palestine has always been part of something else. Just to give a little bit of background of the ancient history of Palestine, we're not going to dive into that, but it's important to know. Before this, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and before that, it was part of the Mamluk state. And before that, it was part of the Abbasids and the Umayyads, and before Islam came to Palestine, it was part of the Roman Empire and part of the Persian Empire, and it would go back and forth between these two great empires, and before that, it was part of a whole cast of ancient empires. It was always part of something else. It was always significant in and of itself. We know, and we should re-educate ourselves on its religious history, its spiritual Islamic history, the importance of Palestine as a site of the Temple of Suleiman, as being a crucial nexus or center in the story of Ibrahim alayhi, but it's always been part of a much larger world. But that brings us then to the Ottoman Empire, maybe the last time that Palestine was actually part of something much bigger. So World War I begins. I won't get into too much of the detail of politics that leads to that. The Ottoman Empire ends up in opposition to the British Empire in particular, and the French alongside them, and the Russians in the early part of the war, and align with Germany. There's a lot of discussion of people say, the Ottomans shouldn't have gotten involved in something like World War I. Why did they get involved with it? You hear that a lot. I won't go too deep into that, but just really quickly, I'll say that that's a very ahistorical argument. It's a little nonsensical. The Ottoman Empire was a functioning part of the world of European empires. It was absolutely one of those empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Empire and the German Empire and the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. These were a full set of closely interacting political entities, and so there really wasn't this choice that they decided to jump in. To really understand this, we have to go into the whole differentiation between Europe and the Middle East and all that, but we'll just say that that wasn't there, and the Ottoman Empire goes into World War I. The British, their main goal in World War I, there's a lot of other aspects going on here, but their main goal in World War I is to secure oil in the Middle East. It's such a familiar trope of Western warfare in the Middle East because these actions back in World War I are what laid the foundation for the whole relationship of Western states with the Middle East. So these echoes that we see today, they're echoes of this moment. The British want to get oil in the Middle East, and for them at the time that particularly means oil in Iran, oil in Persia and Eastern Iraq. That's the most oil-rich area at the time, or the area of the most identified oil. Today, that's going to be Saudi Arabia, but at the time, there had been no oil discovered yet in Saudi Arabia. So Persia was the goal, and Britain really wanted to secure that, and they were able to secure a certain relationship with the royal family. This is the family that's ultimately going to give us the Shah of the last century. They were able to secure oil deals with the Persians, or with the Iranians. But the Ottoman Empire is this big force, this very significant state with one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and it's coming in between Britain's desire for oil and their ability, or their discovery of oil in Persia and Iran, and their ability to really secure it. So Britain wants to make sure that they have strong access to that oil, because at the time oil has become the main source of contention in a war of escalation. Britain is facing off with the German Empire. They're each trying to get to a point where they have the strongest navy in the world. They've each identified or bought in to some extent to these kind of geographic imaginaries of the world that argue that having a strong navy and being able to control the seas of the world is how you're going to exert power in the world. So they both want to have the best navy. And at the time, both of them have coal-fueled navies. Their ships are fueled by coal. And Britain starts to identify that if they really want to get that edge over the German navy, they're going to have to start using oil. Because on a coal ship, you have to carry all of this coal. You have to carry little lumps of coal, and it all has to be stored somewhere. And because it's these, big rocks of coal, that's going to take up a lot of space, and you can only carry so much, and it weighs down the ship a whole lot. It makes the ship slower. It doesn't burn as clean, and then you have to employ men who they store the coal at the front of the ship, and then they have their engines at the back of the ship, and then you have to have men who literally go and run a wheelbarrow from one end of the ship, shovel it up, fill it with coal, and then run it back to the other end of the ship. It's much more efficient. The British identify that if we have an oil-fueled navy, then you can carry a whole lot more oil because it's liquid, fill up a whole lot more space, carry a whole lot more oil, you can travel farther, it burns cleaner, the ships run faster, and you don't have to have men running back and forth. You just tighten it from one end of the ship to the other. So it's much more efficient navy. And they identify, but the problem is there's no oil in either Germany or England. Right? England has huge stores of coal. They have huge coal fields in Wales, but they don't have any native supplies of oil. And that's what gets them interested in this oil that they're starting to identify in Persia. And that's what starts to build up World War I and set off. So World War I is often depicted as this conflict between the British Empire and the German Empire. And the way that it's taught today, the Middle East is kind of an afterthought, right? We focus on everything that's going on in Europe. It's all about France and Germany and Britain and Austria-Hungary. And the Middle East is like, oh yeah, there were also some battles being fought in the Middle East. What it actually was that the center of conflict, the real center of all of the victory conditions, particularly of the British Empire, was that oil that was there in the Middle East. And they wanted to make sure that Britain had stable, secure access to that oil to keep that navy running for as long as they wanted to be a power in the world, which is forever. And so it's going to define everything else that's going to come out of this conflict. The Ottoman Empire refuses to give Britain just easy access to this oil. They're another empire. They're a state that's in at least competition, will emerge into direct conflict with Britain later on. They're not going to just hand over a vital resource, because the Ottoman Empire is in control of a lot of those oil fields in Iraq. Right? There's a lot more in Persia, but Britain wants both, and they want that easy access from Persia into the Mediterranean, so that they can ship that oil back up to the UK. And the Ottoman Empire says, no, we're not doing this. Right? And Britain says at that point that we're going to get that oil, whether you give it to us or whether we have to take it by force. And then once World War I kicks off, those are the sides that are going to be facing off against each other, right? So this is just kind of a little bit of a, I know I said I wouldn't, but I had to. A little bit of an explanation of that, or a little bit of a counter-argument against that point of people saying, why did the Ottomans get involved in World War I? This was not a choice that was being made. This was not some kind of desire to be viewed as European. This was just how they were functioning in the world, and the way that the politics led them into it. So Britain had a real problem. They got into World War I, and they consistently failed to take any ground against the Ottoman Empire. At this point, they already had secured Egypt, but they wanted to get deeper into the area of Sham, greater Syria, right? The countries of modern-day Syria and Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon. But they had no success. They were defeated at the Suez Canal. They were defeated in the first Battle of Gaza. They were defeated at the Battle of Gallipoli. The Battle of Gallipoli, I forget the exact numbers of casualties, but it's one of the highest casualty rates of any battle in history. Just a huge number on both sides, but significant damage done to the British forces at the Battle of Gallipoli. Gallipoli is somewhere right around here, so it's an important crossing point into Asia Minor. And so they're not able to just take them head on. They weren't able to just keep pushing their armies eastward and start taking that territory, so they decided we have to have another strategy. And that other strategy is that they start reaching out to a man who is essentially the Ottoman governor of the region of Hijaz. Hijaz is the mountain range that runs down the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea coast. This is the region that the Prophet ﷺ comes from. The main cities of Hijaz are Mecca and Medina and Ta'if. And the whole story, the whole seerah of the Prophet ﷺ is centered in this region. And there's a man who at this point is essentially what we'd call a governor, but what they call the Sharif of Mecca. His name is Hussein ibn Ali. And at this point, there's a lot of politics going on in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is starting to secularize by this point. There's a lot of moves by a new movement of Ottoman politicians called the Young Turks. They're trying to change the whole nature of the Ottoman Empire. They're trying to get rid of the old systems, the old structures, and westernize. And they want to have, a French legal system and a German economic system. And so there's a lot of conflict internally. And Hussein ibn Ali, Sharif Hussein, is part of this conflict. He's very well aware of this. And he starts to get news that the Ottoman Empire is going to depose him. They want to remove him, and they want to establish another governor who they feel will be more loyal to them or less of a risk to them. And right at this time, the British decide this is the chink in the armor that we really want to manipulate. And so they send a man. His name is Henry McMahon. He's the head of what they call the Arab Bureau in Egypt. Remember, by this point, Britain was already in control of Egypt. And they send him, they instruct him to contact Hussein Sharif and start making deals with him. And he reaches out to him, and there's a series of letters. They're called the Hussein Sharif, they're called the Hussein McMahon correspondence. It's a series of letters going back and forth to them. They're all public now, where he's making all of these deals, and he's telling him, he's working these ideas with him, telling him, don't you want really your own power? You've been ruled by the Ottomans. And he starts tapping into particular feelings and particular tribal instincts of Hussein Sharif. And he tells him, isn't Islam really an Arab religion? Shouldn't it really be Arabs who are in control? You've been ruled by Turks now all these times. Can a Turk really be a Khalifa? And you have these British officials who start talking about the Shari'i requirements of a Khalifa, and they start talking about what it really means to be a Muslim, and how identity should be part of this, and how the nation of a person affects who can really be in these positions. And what he's really trying to do is build this idea of nationalism within the political thinking of Hussein Sharif. And then he makes this deal. He says, look, if you work with us, you help us fight against the Ottomans, you attack the Ottomans from the Arabian Peninsula, from where they're least protected, then we will promise you that after the war, when we defeat the Ottoman Empire, we're going to grant you control of all of the territories from the Taurus Mountains. If you look at, jump back to this map, this kind of line right here between modern-day Turkey and Syria. Think about northern Syria, southeast Turkey. There's a mountain range. It runs all the way along the southern coast of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. It's called the Taurus Mountains. He's saying, we'll give you everything from the Taurus Mountains to the Arabian Sea. So we're going to give you all of this here. That will be your Arab state, and you will be the Khalifa of the Muslim world, and you'll be the king of this whole state. So modern-day Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all of the Gulf states and Yemen. He's saying, we're going to give all of that to you. That's all under Ottoman control right now. We're going to, you help us, we'll hand that over. And eventually Hussein agrees. And he leads a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. He declares the Ottoman Khalifa to be a disbeliever. He declares that the Ottoman Khalifa is not a Muslim, he's abandoned Islam, and that he is now the true Khalifa, Hussein. And anybody who supports the Ottoman Empire, they're supporting a kafir, so now they're also kafirs or murtads, and so that he just starts to use this Islamic rhetoric to try and create a new political movement. He's able to unite many of the tribes of the Hijaz region, and they start attacking the Ottoman Empire. This happens in 1916, where they launch what's called the Arab Revolt. For the purposes of this history, it's important when you're talking about the history of World War I, where generally the Arab Revolt means the revolt of 1916 to 1919. In Palestinian history, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, the Arab Revolt refers to another event. So there's two Arab revolts in history, just important to be aware. So they start the Arab Revolt. Starts off end of 1916, goes into it starts off, I think, in 1917, and it'll go up until 1919. But when they get into 1918, they get to November of 1918. They're making huge headway against the Ottomans. He sends his two sons. He gives each of them, or he has three sons, but he sends two of them. He gives Amir Faisal, his son, charge of the east, the northern army, and the northern army goes up from Hijaz. I should just keep this map. Goes up from Hijaz, up the coast here, and starts attacking, going basically into Palestine and Syria. Their main goal is to disrupt, there's a railroad that goes all the way from Constantinople or Istanbul, all the way down to Medina. It's called the Ottoman Hijaz Railroad. And that's their main goal, is to disrupt that railroad, because that's the main military supply route that the Ottomans are using for this region. So they're heading for Jerusalem and Damascus. That's under Faisal. His other son is Abdullah. Abdullah's going to take the Eastern Army, and he's going to go over to the Persian Gulf and start attacking the areas of modern-day Kuwait and Iraq. Right? And they're making huge headway. By the time they get to November of 1917, and this is the flag of the Arab revolts. There's a couple different theories of where this flag came from, but most likely it was made by a man named Mark Sykes, who was an officer in the Arab Bureau in Cairo. And he designed this for Hussein Sharif, and this becomes the flag of the Sharif family and the flag of the Arab revolts. You can see so many flags built into this. When I think I included. Yeah. So we're going to see a lot of this history is going to come out of this moment because all of these other flags are derived from that flag very meaningfully, very intentionally. These flags don't happen by accident. So we have all of those. And there are a lot more flags besides these are just the main ones that derive from these. These four colors are called the Pan-Arab colors. They're kind of assigned to the Arab world by the British. So, November of 1917, they're halfway through their revolts. They're now dealing significant blows. The Arab armies are dealing significant blows to the Ottoman Empire. But two things happened in that month. Firstly, the Russian Empire collapses. There's the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the Bolsheviks, they take over the capital, they kill the royal family, if you know the story of Anastasia. This is where her and her family are killed, the Tsar is killed. And then they go into and they start going through all of these government documents. And they find that there's this secret document that was made by the British and the French and the Russians. They made a secret agreement at the beginning of the war, leaving out a bunch of their own allies, and obviously it's secret from their enemies. They have a secret deal that once they defeat, or that they're already planning, that when we defeat the Ottoman Empire, all those promises that we made about giving the Arabs land and giving other people land and making these deals with even a country like America, this is cut out of this. It's kind of a shot to America at the time. And they say, no. From the beginning, we are saying that Britain is going to get certain territory. That's this red territory, the area, the B area here. France is going to get a certain territory, and then Russia is going to get the yellow areas here. Green is Italy. This is the final version of the map that comes in later. And the Bolsheviks find this, and they want to embarrass the Russian Empire that they just overthrew. And so they immediately go and publish this. And it comes to light, and the Arabs learn about it, everybody learns about it. And it becomes very clear that while McMahon is making all of these promises to Hussein that you're going to get everything from the Taurus Mountains over here all the way down to the sea, and all of this is going to be one united Arab kingdom, that they're very clearly planning, they're making this deal with France in particular, that we're going to split this all up and we're getting all of this territory ourselves. It shows there was never any intention. This is halfway through the Arab Revolt. The other thing that happens, actually technically happens first, in November of 1917, is the Balfour Declaration. The war at this point has been going on for longer than Britain expected it to go on for. It's costing them so much. There's a lot of discussion about the intentions of the Balfour Declaration, but one of the main arguments that's given is Arthur Balfour. He's a member of the House of Lords in Britain, an important, very significant member of the British government, and he's trying to secure funding from very wealthy Jewish families in Russia and America, and in particular the Rothschild family. The Rothschild family is a huge tribe, essentially. It's many different families, all related together in different countries. Particularly, they were quite powerful in Russia and the United States. And Britain wants to ensure two things. One, they want that funding, and two, probably even more importantly, they want those families that are well situated in both Russia and the United States to keep pressure on those governments, to keep those governments involved in what's essentially Britain's war. They want America and Russia to stay involved because at this point, America hasn't even officially, or has just officially joined, but there's a lot of hesitancy. And there's a lot of anti-war sentiment in the United States, and Russia just had this revolution, and there's a lot of fear that they're going to start pulling Russian troops out of the war. So Britain wants to keep them involved, and one of the main ways that they're going to do that is by Balfour making this declaration. So he pushes this through the British government, and it's worth reading the specific content. It's a single sentence. The Balfour Declaration is just one sentence, but one of the most impactful sentences in our history. It says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And immediately, this becomes, this is just a declaration within the British government. This is not a law or anything, and you can see, it's important to note the language that's being used. They say they want to create a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. There is no, at the time, there's no political term, national home. So and they do this intentionally. They could have said a state. They could have said that they want to, give some other form of controlling power. There are a lot of available words to use. They choose to use this term national home because this is what Britain is doing with everyone. They want to make promises, they want to keep them as vague as possible. And a lot of people at the time, they call out this term national home. What are you saying here, right? That there's this kind of vague conceptualization of what they want to do with this, this area. And then they're trying to say, we're going to give this to the Jewish people, but then it's not going to affect anybody else, and everyone else is still, they're trying to play all sides at the same time. Excuse me. One of the only people to resist this is, at the time, the only Jewish, and I think he's the third Jew to be given an official office in the British government, in the whole of Britain's history. And at the time, he's the only Jew in government. His name is Edwin Montagu, and he comes out harshly against this. And he says this declaration is nonsensical because the second half of this sentence completely undoes the first half of this sentence. It doesn't make sense that you want to argue that you want to give Jews a state in the world, but that you're going to make sure that nobody in that state is going to have their rights violated, and Jews aren't going to have their, essentially their membership in other states transgressed against. And he writes a very long statement. It's like 2 or 3 pages, but this is just one part of it. He says, I assume that it means that Mohammedans and Christians are to make way for the Jews, and that the Jews should be put in all positions of preference and should be peculiarly associated with Palestine in the same way that England is with the English or France is with the French, that Turks and other Mohammedans, and Turks was the general term that they used for the most part for Muslims, that Turks and other Mohammedans in Palestine will be regarded as foreigners just in the same way as Jews will hereafter be treated as foreigners in every country but Palestine. Perhaps also citizenship must be granted only as a result of a religious test. He's identifying exactly what this situation is going to lead to. He's saying if you go ahead with this, you're just going to create a situation where anybody there who's not a Jew is going to lose all of their rights, and any Jew in any other part of the world is going to lose their rights. And we see this fully at play here today. The situation of Palestinians and non-Jews in Palestine is very clear, but also the other situation is really starting to become much more clear now. Just a few months ago at this point, Biden makes this declaration when he says that Biden as the president of the most powerful country in the world with a large Jewish population says that Israel is the only place where Jews are really safe. Essentially coming out and saying, as the president of this country, I am telling my Jewish population that you're not really safe here and you shouldn't feel really safe here. It's a significant moment in the history of Jews in the modern world. So Edwin Montagu is able to identify this. He's able to understand what this really means and what's coming out of this. All of this, so like I said, going back to Sykes-Picot, that map that I showed here is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement because it was made between Mark Sykes and, I can't remember Picot's first name. Picot is the French negotiator, Mark Sykes is the British negotiator, and they make this secret agreement between them. So it's the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, they come out in November of 1917. This is halfway through the Arab Revolt. At this point, Hussein tells both of his sons, stop the revolt, pause your armies, and the British immediately reach out to him. And he's telling them what's going on here. You made this promise to us. You said we're getting everything from the Taurus Mountains all the way down to the sea. And now you're telling us that, or now we find out that you and the French are planning on carving all this up for yourselves. And then at the same time, you're planning on giving Palestine over to the Zionists. And the British immediately tell him, no, this is not, all of this stuff, all this other stuff, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, that's just wartime negotiation. That's just what you have to do in war. But they told them, we're lying to the French, we're lying to the Jews. The only promise that we really care about is the promise that we're making to you. Just as a note, if anybody here ever ends up in wartime negotiations, if somebody tells you we're lying to all the other guys, but we're being honest with you, that's a horrible person to make a negotiation with. And and Hussein buys it. They put a ton of effort in. This is where significant figures like General Allenby, if you've ever entered Palestine from Jordan, you cross over the Allenby Bridge. This is where that man comes from. General Allenby, he's fighting alongside Amir Faisal and who's the lion, not the lion of the desert, the other desert one, the other British operative, Lawrence of Arabia. What's his real name? Lawrence of Arabia. I can't remember his name. This is where these figures start really putting in their work, right? They convince Faisal, they're both working with Faisal. They convince Faisal to keep going. McMahon is working with Hussein, telling him, no, we're really gonna do this. It does seem, or some people argue that McMahon really did believe what he was telling Hussein, because as soon as the British officially break their deal with the Arabs at the end of the war, McMahon resigns in protests and leaves the British government, and he declares that they made him lie to somebody, and so clearly there's deals going on even within the British government. So all of this comes out, but the Arabs continue their assault on the Ottoman Empire, and by the end of 1919, the Ottoman Empire has completely collapsed. The Arabs defeated, and they took out this Hejaz Railroad. They significantly helped the British with the second assault on Gaza, so there's two battles in Gaza during World War I. The second battle, they overrun the Ottoman lines, and they go very quickly at that point all the way up to Jerusalem, and then the Ottoman Empire collapses shortly after that. So 1919 ends World War I, and the British end up in control of all of this territory, and they create what's called the Mandate System. The Mandate System is just another form of colonialism. The League of Nations is established to monitor this Mandate System, and basically what it is, as they say here, it assigns the obligation and task of the advanced nations to help backward peoples develop and establish governance. So it's this idea that it's kind of a temporary colonialism, viewed as this idea of a temporary colonialism, where the British are going to get the mandate for Iraq and Palestine and a few other places. The French are going to get the mandate for Syria and Lebanon, and they last on average about 20 some years, and it's supposed to be this idea of these Western countries poaching these new nations that they're creating in the Middle East. So they take this Ottoman Empire that's for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, this region that has functioned more or less as a single entity with power forces going back and forth, but as a single region that's always kind of worked together, and they divide it up and they say each of you now is a new nation state in the model of European nation states. It's a totally new idea of governance, that you are the people of this state. If you live in Syria, you have to be a Syrian, not a Syrian, you have to be a Syrian. And if you're in Palestine, it's because you're a Palestinian. If you're in Lebanon, it's because you are Lebanese and you belong to that state. And they create this whole idea, just like Montague was saying about what would happen with the Jewish situation, when he's saying that you're going to create a peculiar association with Palestine for Jews, right? Just as this has already happened in Western Europe. It's this new model of how people are going to engage with the world. That you belong to that place, and that place really belongs to you. Right? And it creates all of this conflict, a huge amount of conflict in the world, because the moment that you go from saying that where you live doesn't necessarily identify you as a human being, and you have this freedom of movement, and other people can come in. And that's how the world functioned for most of its history. As long as you weren't an army, as long as you weren't trying to take control of a place, most people had freedom to move and live in different places. But the moment that you create this peculiar association, that you say that you, because of your genetics, your heritage, your language, your skin color, or some feature of you as a person makes you inherently attached to this particular place, then you're going to get a lot of conflicts over who really gets that attachment. Right? So they do this in Palestine, create a mandate for Palestine. It starts out much bigger. There was never a country called Jordan in the entire history of the world. Jordan was only ever a river. There's no place that was referred to as Jordan. When the term Palestine was used, it changed in its 3,000-year history of the name Palestine. It started out actually specifically referring to the area of Gaza, just immediately around Gaza. So for a long period of history, Jerusalem wasn't considered Palestine, it was its own place. But it evolved, it changed over time, right? Names kind of move and they expand and they grow and they change and they shrink. By this point, the British say, okay, we're carving out this area and this is now our mandate for Palestine, right? But there's a particular series of events that occurs. I won't go, actually I will go into the details, I'm not going to promise that. Faisal, when all of this happens with the League of Nations, remember Faisal was one of the sons of Hussein Sharif, and he has his army, he had the Northern Army. Faisal, he tries to negotiate with the British. He tries for an extended period of time. He just keeps going along with them. He goes to the Treaty of Versailles in France, which is where the allotments of former Ottoman territories is distributed between European powers. And he goes there still believing that they're still going to somehow honor their promise that they made to his father. They're still going to give them this Arab state. It might not be the whole thing, but they're still going to get an Arab state of some kind. And he's completely ignored. Nobody speaks to him while he's at this conference. They just cut him out of all of the negotiations. They ignore all of his advances. At this point, finally, he recognizes Britain's not going to do anything about this. And he goes back and he takes his army and he takes over the city of Damascus. And and he says, now we're establishing an Arab state in Syria. We're going to call it United Syria. It's going to cover all of Bilad al-Sham, all the countries of Greater Syria. So it's going to cover Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Palestine. And we're breaking off from the British and the French, and we're going to fight them if we have to. But Damascus is in Syria, and Syria is now part of the French mandate. So the French say, no, the League of Nations gave this to us, we're taking it back. So the French send their army. They're up in Lebanon. Their army is based in Beirut at the time. And they send their army down to Damascus, and Faisal sends his army. They meet on the border of Lebanon and Syria in a valley called Wadi Maysalun, Valley of Maysalun. They fight one battle, it lasts 4 hours, and the Arabs are completely wiped out. Their army is crushed, the French go in, they take over Damascus, and they exile Faisal. At this point, Faisal's brother has the Eastern Army, he's over in Iraq. And he brings his army around, Abdullah. And he brings his army around, and he comes up into the area of Palestine and Syria from the south. And he goes and he's making for Damascus. He wants to attack Damascus, take it back, and give it back to his brother. And he makes camp on a very tall hill in a place called Amman, which is a very small Circassian village, just on the other side of the Jordan River. And he makes camp there, and he's preparing to go attack Damascus. Winston Churchill, at this point, is on his way down to Cairo. And he's sailing down to Cairo to finalize. It's in Cairo that the mandates from the League of Nations are going to be finalized. So he's on his way to Cairo. He immediately detours. He goes and he meets Abdullah in Amman, right, where his army is camped, about to attack Damascus. And he tells him, look, the British are in Egypt. The French are now in Syria. If you go and attack them, we're both going to attack you. We're going to fight you from the front. We're going to fight you from behind. You're going to be wiped out. You're going to get nothing. He says, if you want, we'll give you something here. You guys can come away from all of this with some kind of control. he says, look, we have the mandate for Palestine. And Britain at this point is really trying to secure peace as fast as possible. The French are ready to fight everybody to get their colonial holdings. They have a very different political mindset. The British, they want to secure peace as quickly as possible. Go all the way back to the beginning here. Because what do the British want? Remember, going way back to the beginning, the British, they want that oil that's coming out of Iran and Iraq. And that's why they designed this the way that they do. They just created a corridor. That's all they really cared about, was they wanted to create a British-controlled corridor going from those oil fields in Iran and Iraq all the way to the Mediterranean. So Palestine's a significant part of that, because they want to start shipping that oil up to Britain. Now they want to secure peace as quickly as possible, because it's hard to develop roads and railroads and start shipping oil out of a place that's in turmoil. So he tells him, look, we have the mandate for Palestine. Here's what we'll do. We'll split it in half. And we'll give you this area, we'll call it Transjordan. Trans is a very common geographic term at the time. It means on the other side of something. That's the Latin word, right? So Transjordan means the land on the other side of the Jordan River. So you end up with two areas. Technically, they're called Transjordan and Cisjordan. Those terms have taken on totally different meanings today. Well, they're actually the same meaning, but different kind of concept. But Palestine is Cisjordan and Jordan is Transjordan. So the land on this side of the Jordan River and land on that side of the Jordan River. And cut it in half, and we'll give you this. This will be your kingdom. Right? We promised you everything from the Taurus Mountains all the way to the Arabian Sea, but we can't do that. Our deals, they went their own way. We're not going to give you that territory, but we'll give you this half, which is a country that's 85% desert and has no natural water resources, if you take out the Jordan River, which they did. So he says, we'll give you this. Your army's camped right here, and then he says, we also have the mandate for Iraq, right? And Jordan and Iraq connect, right? That's that route that the British want. They say, we have the mandate for Iraq. We'll take your brother Faisal. He got kicked out of Damascus. We'll make him king in Baghdad. So your brother gets Iraq, you get Jordan, your family's at least coming away with something, and you're not going to get wiped out. And Abdullah agrees. So they take Faisal, he becomes the king of Iraq. You get the Hashemi kingdom of Iraq, and Abdullah stays where he is in Amman, and they become the Hashemi kingdom of Jordan, which is the state that we have today. Eventually, Iraq will have a revolution, and they'll overthrow and kill their Hashemi family. So it's not that state will change, but Jordan is still the same family. Abdullah has, I think it's he has a son, and then the grandson is the current king. Right? And so this direct line that we have coming from the events of that day. So this is the British mandate of Palestine. It's established officially on the 29th of September 1923, and it's at this point that the borders of Palestine, that shape, that particular shape that we know and love so much, is created. The British are the ones that they draw those lines out. They define what exactly is Palestine and Lebanon and Egypt, and then they cut off Jordan, and so Palestine as the place that we know it today is born in that moment. In their original declaration for the mandate of Palestine, they just basically rehashed it's almost the exact same wording of the Balfour Declaration, showing that in the end what they really did go with, even though the British were telling Hussein that this is just wartime negotiations, you don't have to worry about this. The only things that actually did work out in the end were the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. So they worded that the Balfour Declaration right into their declaration of the mandate for British Palestine. It's supposed to go up until the end, I believe, of 1948, but they end up kind of repealing it quite suddenly on May 15th of 1948. At this point, all right, I'm right at the end here. I'm going to go just a little bit over, if you guys don't mind. At this point, it's important to talk about what's going on in Arab politics here. So the British have just created this new state, right? And they're they've introduced this entirely new political model into the Muslim world, right? They've divided up what was a continuous region of the world for so long into these discrete states. Now they're telling everybody here that the only way for you to really be a civilized, functioning government in the world is for you to have this very Western European idea of nationalism, of the nation state. A nation is a group of people. A state is a political entity. Both of those have existed throughout history. But this idea says we're putting those two different concepts together. That it's a particular nation that has legitimacy to run a state in a given territory. Right? It becomes highly race-based. And all that we've done for the last 100 years in our political philosophy is try and find ways of philosophizing around this idea to not make it about race and racism. But it's been entirely unsuccessful, and Palestine shows that to us in this world better than any other place. So that's what's going on with the British. For the Arabs now, they have to adapt to this new idea, or they have to respond to this new idea. And we see this throughout the 20s and 30s, this conflict. And there's a lot going on in the internal Arab politics of Palestine in the 20s and 30s. But to boil it down to its most simple, I'm going to say that there are two sides here. There's really a whole lot more, but I'm going to say essentially that there are two large ideas at play in all of this. One group of Arabs in Palestine says that the British have come in as colonizers. They have, occupied all of this territory. They've undone and thrown out all of our traditional forms of leadership. They collapsed the Ottoman Empire. They start throwing out all of the local forms of leadership, the tribal forms of leadership, the city, urban structures of leadership. And we need to resist them as you would resist any occupying force. And this needs to be something that's done by everyone. The French are have established their mandate, and they've taken control over Syria and Lebanon, and the British have taken over Palestine and Iraq and Jordan. But they're saying this is all of us just being occupied by two powers. So they say there's no difference between a Palestinian and a Syrian and a Lebanese fighting against these occupying forces, and we have to fight all of them together. They're saying, even though I said the name Palestine is very old, they're saying we can't just say, oh, we're Palestinian. We're not just going to let the British come in and tell us who precisely is Palestinian and tell us that just because I happen to live in the place that I call Palestine, I can't go and join the Syrians and help them fight against the French occupation. So you have this kind of larger regional sentiment that develops among, or that's maintained among some people within the kind of political movements that are taking place in modern day Palestine. And they form a newspaper because at the time, one of the main forms of resistance that was done globally was you had to establish a newspaper. So they form a newspaper called Surya Junubiya, right? They're saying we're calling this part of the world that we happen to be living in southern Syria because we're part of Sham. We've always been part of Sham. Palestine is part of this larger part of the world. And they're using that kind of geographic designation to identify their political view. Right, that we have to be fighting, all of us together, against these occupying forces, the French and the British. The other side says, look, it is what it is. The war is over, the Ottomans are gone, and you now have the British and the French in control of these territories. They've created these states that we now live in, so now we have to accept that we live in Palestine, and the people on the other side of that river, they're living in Jordan, and those other guys there are living in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and all of that, and we just have to accept that the British have this mandate system, and they're planning on creating a nation state out of this mandate. We've got about 20 years to put ourselves together, and we should work with the British and have them choose us. At the end of all of this, they're going to choose one of these groups to lead this state, and we want them to choose the Arab population of Palestine. And we want to create the state of Palestine in the image of the British and the Western European states that are being created here. Let's just work with what we have. So these are two opposing views. They form their paper, Palestine. Again, they're using those geographic toponyms, those place names, as kind of a call sign for their political belief, their idea of what should we be doing now given the certain situation that we have. And many of the figures that we know in Palestinian history, pretty much all of them, are going to come out of one side or another of these two groups. And that brings us to a very significant figure in Palestinian history, Abdl-Haleem, who really captures a different view of this region than we're usually given in the kind of nation-state-based history that we rely on so much. Because Abdl-Haleem is viewed as this great Palestinian figure of history, but he's from Syria. He was born and grew up in Jeddah in Syria. He was educated at Al-Azhar University. He's born, obviously, during the Ottoman Empire. And he goes to Egypt. He gets educated at Al-Azhar. He is a Hanafi Qadi, very prominent Hanafi Qadi. And he's a Qadiriya Sufi. He's a very traditional figure of Islamic authority in this region. When he was younger, he fought in the Ottoman military against the British. He left his studies, went and he fought in the war, and then when the armies were defeated and the Ottoman Empire was abolished, he went back and completed his studies and then started teaching. Once the French fully secured their mandate over Syria, at a certain point he joined the resistance in Syria and started fighting against the French there. Was eventually, again, the group that he was fighting alongside were defeated, and he was forced to leave Syria. And he goes and he settles in Haifa, in Palestine, under British control at this point. And he becomes a very popular teacher in the city of Haifa. He becomes very attached to the community of Haifa. He's a classic kind of Muslim scholar who views his mission as the care of the people of the city that he's living amongst. And he becomes a teacher at an Islamic school there in Haifa. He eventually kind of gets fired or quits because they said he was always late to class. He had to teach classes, and he was always late. He was always late because he would leave home and he would walk to school, and all along the way people would come and they would stop him and they would say, "Yeah, Sheikh, I'm having this problem with my neighbor, how do I resolve it? Or my family is having this issue, or there's an inheritance issue here." And they would come and they would just pester him with questions. And because he was so committed to serving the people of his city, he would stop and he would give them responses, and he would talk with people, and he would always end up being late to class, so eventually he gets fired. And he says, that's okay. I believe that as Muslim scholars, we have to be taking care of the people of these cities. He says all the old structures are gone. The Ottomans are gone. The whole Qadi system is gone. Al-Azhar is, now under British control. The whole Muslim world is being divided up between these empires. We're losing all of these structures. He says we really have to be here as scholars for the people. Eventually, he starts saying, look, we need to start resisting these powers. He's going to move into that Surya Junubiya camp, that kind of political stance that this is not a Palestinian issue and then the Syrians have their issue with the French. He's saying, no, all of us are being occupied by these forces and all of us need to be fighting against this. And so he starts an organization called called the Black Hand. He starts taking a lot of his students and starts training them. Remember, he was a soldier in the Ottoman Empire, he fought in resistance against the Syrians. He starts training these young men. He creates this organization that spreads out across Syria and Palestine, a very decentralized organization, and he starts fighting against and taking military action against the British and the French empires. Eventually, there's a particular battle outside of Haifa. Him and 10 of his men are trapped in a cave by British soldiers, and he tells them, "My lions, we fought together all this time. Let's die together now. This is the path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set for us." And he runs out of the cave, he attacks the British soldiers, and he's killed. And the news of his death spreads all around the Muslim world immediately. And they say, I don't know if I put a number here. I don't remember the number. They say it was somewhere in the area of hundreds of thousands of people came to attend his funeral. They say it was one of the largest funerals in the history of Palestine, the entire history. I think they said that the funeral that had a larger number than him was the funeral of Salah ad-Din in Damascus. So hundreds of thousands of people come from around the Muslim world to attend his funeral. The news of his death spreads all around the world. The Egyptian newspaper, Haram, writes in a rich way of him, I heard you preaching up in the pulpit, summoning to the sword. Through your death, you are more eloquent than ever you were in life. So his death has this cataclysmic effect on his world. He was killed in 1935. In 1936, we get the Arab revolt of Palestinian history. There's this big uprising in Palestine, kind of triggered by his death and a few other events. Shortly after his death, there's this situation where dock workers in Haifa, they're unloading a ship that's just come from Bulgaria, I believe. And they open up these crates, and they find that these crates are stocked full of weapons. And they realize that the Zionist organization, which was working largely in the Haifa area, was shipping in all these weapons. Britain at this time had a complete ban because there was a lot of tension emerging now between the Arab and Jewish populations. So they had a weapons ban on Palestine. Nobody was allowed to be importing weapons. So the Zionists, it's revealed, were smuggling weapons in. The Arabs find this and they realize, we're in this situation now. The British are kind of have set up this situation where the Arab and the Jewish populations are racing to see who's going to get the state of Palestine that the British are going to declare, and it's leading to this territorial conflict, this necessity for people to fight to come out on top. And then once they find that the Zionist organization is smuggling in weapons during the time of this weapon ban, then things just come to a head, and you have this huge Arab revolt all across Palestine. You get these popular level actions being taken where people are attacking villages and they're fighting back and forth, and they're attacking police stations, British police stations, and these kinds of things. And that will last throughout most of 1936, and this becomes the beginning of what's just going to keep on going as war and conflict throughout this region. By the time we get into the 1940s, World War II happens, and the British Empire changes dramatically in its nature in the world. So the British Empire, they're losing control of India, they're losing control of most of their overseas colonial holdings. World War II just devastated them. It's very clear now that America is going to take their place, and Britain just wants to get out of this situation. They tried to hold on to Palestine for as long as they could. They created this situation now where there's just massive conflict back and forth between Jewish and Arab populations. And at this point they say, we just want to get out of this, right? And they do so in a very British way. Whenever Britain pulls out of a colony, they make sure that they leave it with as much division and sectarian violence as possible. You see this in India and Pakistan. The British create the partition of Pakistan in order to make sure that once they pull out, there's still going to be some conflict and fighting in this region, right? We're going to keep it just a little destabilized. They do this in South Africa. When the British pull out of South Africa, they create the context that's eventually going to lead to apartheid being developed there, and then they're going to do the exact same thing here. Right? So they start pushing this idea of a partition plan. The United Nations is established essentially in 1946, and immediately the first problem, one of the first issues that's discussed in the formation of the United Nations is the question of Palestine. How is this region going to be addressed and dealt with? And there's two plans that are put forward. One plan is called the Democratic Plan. It's almost never referred to. You always hear about the partition plan. The Democratic Plan was a plan that roughly half of the countries in the United Nations supported. And they said that we should create a state that doesn't have any particular ethnic or religious designation in Palestine. Everybody who's in Palestine becomes a citizen of Palestine, and then the people vote what kind of government they want to have and what kind of structures they want to have within their state, whether they're Arab or Jewish. The other plan, which got literally, I think, 2 or 3 more votes in the United Nations, was the partition plan. And the partition plan is the idea of what you see here on this map, very famous partition map, that the blue areas are going to go to the Jews of the region, and the orange areas are going to go to the Arab population. The Jews, with 35% of the population, are going to get 56% of the land. We're going to divide it up neatly like this, so each one gets kind of 3 areas, and then they're going to be linked by these very complicated, physically and politically complicated kind of transition zones between these places, and they work out this intricate, terrible idea. And that's the one that passes through. But Britain says, okay, great, we worked out this partition plan. The United Nations says we need to send in a team to make sure that this is all handled well, and you need to give us enough time to put this into effect. And as soon as the United Nations announces this partition plan, 29 December, they announce their partition plan. On December 11th, the British say, by the way, we're not pulling out at the end of the year like we said we were, we're pulling out May 15th. They just drop this on the United Nations. And then the United Nations goes into chaos, and they say, okay, we need to put this plan into effect now. We need to start working on this. And Britain says no United Nations members are allowed to come and enter the territory of Palestine until after Britain leaves. So Britain is trying to create this context where there's work being done. Even if it's a terrible idea, there's still a ton of work being done where they're trying to say, okay, how do we figure this out? And consistently Britain keeps pushing this, putting up these barriers and saying, no, things are going to dissolve into chaos, and then we'll see what you guys want to do with that. So they pull up May 1948. They just kind of up and leave, and things fall into chaos pretty much immediately. This is where we get the Nakba, 1948. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians expelled from their homes. Most of us, I think, at this point are pretty well familiar with what happens here. You get a series, just a kind of a taste of what's going on. You get a series of these massacres. As soon as 1948, as soon as the conflict in 1948 kicks off, and like I said, there was already relatively low-level conflict that had been going on throughout Palestine now for 10 or 12 years. But as soon as the British officially pull out, you see that there was a very well-organized Zionist plan for how this was going to go. The Zionists were very well aware this UN negotiation is going through. Everybody's going to end up with a certain amount of territory, but we're not going to go along with whatever this official plan is. We're going to secure as much territory in that moment of chaos as we can. And it's called Plan Dalet. Dalet is Dal, in Hebrew it's D. So Plan D. So their Plan D operation was a very well organized operation. They organized strong stockpiles of weapons and forces in the north near Haifa, and in the south near Be'er-Seba, the desert. And they had a full list of all the villages that they wanted to target. They knew they had population data on all of these villages. They had ethnographic data. They knew names. They knew people. They had all of this information ready to go. They had particular units that were assigned to go to particular villages, and built into this plan was the idea of massacre. That we're going to massacre, we're targeting key villages in each region, and we're going to massacre them, and we're going to send this message to drive out as many people as possible. One of the most famous massacres is the Deir Yassin massacre. And Menachem Begin, who will later become Prime Minister of the State of Israel, said in reference to Deir Yassin, he says Deir Yassin, and he says, "Continue thus until victory, as in Deir Yassin, so everywhere we will attack and smite the enemy." Again, this is important to emphasize, it's not news to us that this is how this particular state is chosen to function, but it's important to emphasize because for the longest time, the argument was that, these massacres were a mistake, they happened every now and then because things happen in war, and war is ugly, and it was just, this is what happens when you have, conflicting religions, people who just can't get along. This was an organized and well-executed plan. You didn't have anything like it on the Arab side, which really wasn't just one side. These are some of the key massacres that occur throughout this time. They all follow pretty much the same plan. Plan Dalet neatly lays out how these massacres are supposed to occur. They would surround the village on three sides, the north, the west, and the south, and keep the east side open, and they would start pushing into the villages from there so that they can push people out eastward. This happens in almost every one of these massacres. The most significant massacre is Lid and Ramla. I forget which city. One of them, they're two neighboring cities, but most of the deaths came, I think, from Lid because, and this was at least, whether it was an accident or intentional from the troops on the ground, it was a divergence from the actual plan. They ended up surrounding the whole city. They cut off the east side as well. was most likely a mistake, so it's not excusing anybody, but it just shows that these massacres were done deliberately. They had a plan, they had a strategy. In the one case where they didn't follow it kind of proves, essentially, that there was a plan, there was a pattern that was being done in every one of these other villages. So, the United Nations tries to wrap this up. They realize this is a terrible disaster. Their whole partition plan has fallen apart. It's led to one of the worst political situations in the world, and they want to try to get control of this as quickly as possible. So they appoint a man named Count Folke Bernadotte, who is a very significant figure in international politics at the time. He's the grandson of the King of Sweden. He's president of the Swedish Red Cross. He's very famous, and they view him as a really good person for this role because he's become very famous because during World War II, he was Sweden's main negotiator with the Nazis to have the Nazis send huge numbers of Jews to Sweden. And so he's viewed as this kind of hero of the Jewish people because he saved the lives of a huge number of Jews and had them sent to Sweden instead of having the Nazis kill them. And so he's a really significant figure. They appoint him as the UN mediator for the issue of Palestine. And he comes in and he says there are 3 things that absolutely have to happen for any kind of peace to be resolved here. And he says, firstly, everyone who's been kicked out from their homes needs to be allowed to go back to their homes immediately. All refugees need to be repatriated. He says Jerusalem needs to be internationalized. We have to take it out of the control of any of these states that are going to be formed here, and everybody needs to have access to it. And then he says we need to go back on our original deal, our original plan, and we need to portion the land based on population distribution. So 35% Jewish population should be getting 56% of the land. He comes in and he says, if there's going to be any hope, this is what has to happen. He goes to Palestine, and he gets assassinated by the IDF, essentially. There's a group which is labeled as a terrorist extremist group. They were a fully functioning, fully legitimate, I forget the technical term, unit within the Haganah, within the Jewish military that will eventually become the IDF. This was a standardized military unit within the IDF, and this is the Lehi, or the Stern Gate in English. And they assassinate him as soon as he arrives in Palestine on September 17th. And the Jewish government, the new Israeli government, says, no, this is not us. The Lehi are a rogue terrorist organization, and they don't represent us, and it wasn't us who killed him, and they immediately kind of sweep this under the rug. But in 1958, so only 10 years later, the leader of the Lehi at the time of the assassination was a man named Itzhak, not Rabin, another Itzhak Shimon. Itzhak Shimon is the leader of the Lehi at the time of the assassination. He'll become prime minister of the state of Israel 10 years later in 1958. So the whole argument of like this was just a rogue, element. This was a fully functioning unit within the Israeli military with figures who retained forever their legitimacy within the Israeli government. They assassinate him. Very quickly, this all gets the UN is just trying to save face by this point. They, work around the fact that this hero of theirs, this, very significant international figure was just assassinated. They basically give Israel all of the whatever they want in terms of establishing a new state. They bring them into the United Nations. The United States brings Israel to the United Nations on the condition that Israel is going to repatriate all of the refugees. They bring them in. Israel then, after they become part of the United Nations, say, no, we're actually not going to do that. Nobody does anything about it. And the situation kind of stabilizes into the situation that we have today. So that leaves us out here. There's a story that I will maybe mention in the Q&A, but that goes along with this picture. But it's just a neat historical story. But that's what brings us to the political situation that we have today. I focused on this era, and I know I've gone well over time here, so I apologize. But I focused on this particular era because so often when we talk about this, we think about Palestine after 1948, Palestine before 1948. And Palestine before 1948 is just this kind of back when Palestine was free. And we just have this kind of vague conceptualization of a free Palestine and then Israeli occupied Palestine. And we think about the 1930s as this great time of Palestinian freedom, not this time of intense British political military occupation. And it's really important for us in trying to address this situation to take a very long view of history, which is why I started out describing the kind of commitment that we have to understanding history, and to understand that we need to think about the ideas that are at play here. When we talk about Palestine being free, when we say from the river to the sea, as a description of what Palestine is, we need to understand what does that mean? What ideas are we tapping into? Who are we following when we start describing the kind of Palestine that we want to see in the future? And that doesn't mean that there's just one way that I want you to think about what needs to be done with Palestine now. It's just I want us to, quite the opposite, open our minds to understand what kind of future are we really trying to work toward when doing this. And to really be able to do that effectively, we need to understand the past that we are coming out of here. So, Jazakumullah khair, thank you all for coming out and listening to me go on for a very long time. And I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have. So.